So in a previous video, I talked about pain. And specifically, I gave a story about getting some dental work done without anesthetic and about why somebody would maybe want to use something like meditation or mindfulness techniques to create a relationship with pain where they're no longer controlled by it. If you're interested in that video, then it's linked below. But in this video, I'm going to go deeper into the topic of masochism and sadism, because on the surface it might look like anyone who's going and doing something like getting dental work done that way has got to be a masochist and they've got to really enjoy pain. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I also think that it's not quite that simple. The way that I like to look at it is there is at least two different types of masochism, and in their nature they are very, very different from each other. The first type of masochism I would just call true masochism. And this is going to be somebody who really enjoys the experience of surrendering and letting go. Okay, that's like the deeper spiritual implications to it. And they want to surrender and let go under conditions that are safe. And what that means is that there's a setup that they can trust, that it's safe for them to surrender to it. So you take the example of getting the kind of dental work I was having done. It's perfectly safe. That pain is not going to actually harm me or injure me in any way. It's just an unpleasant experience, like a very unpleasant experience, but it's not going to actually do any harm. So there's safety there. And if I'm willing to, and if I'm delving into that type of masochism, I would just completely surrender any part of myself that wants to control the situation, that wants to avoid the situation, that wants to escape from the pain, and I would surrender to the experience itself. And so that becomes a portal down into the underlying sensory experiences that are happening. It's really, really, really intense. And in a way, it's just a kind of intensity. Intensity in a lot of ways is exquisite. For a lot of us, we're seeking intensity in different ways. So it might seem a little perverse to seek it through pain in that particular form. But if you just take that judgment away, which is actually kind of arbitrary, it's one of the most deliciously intense forms of experience that you can have in the human vehicle. But the emphasis with that type of masochism is on surrender and release and trust. So now I want to talk about the other type of masochism. And this is what I actually call self-sadism. And I'd call this self with a capital S. This form is definitely more in the style of what I do. And even though we could talk about doing it from the exact same context of the exact same dental procedure, the process that's going on internally for each one is very different. So with a self-sadism form of masochism, it only looks like masochism on the surface. But underneath what's actually happening is that you're deeply, deeply, deeply relaxing into a aspect of yourself which is not identified with your body. It's not identified with the form. It's not identified with the sensations or what's going on. And it's not identified with the so-called ego in any way. It's purely identified as awareness itself. People call it a whole lot of different things: pure witnessing awareness, pure consciousness, the witness, the watcher, the self. In the IFS, internal family systems therapy system, it's called self with a capital S, and that's how I spell self-sadism. So you're relaxing into this deeper aspect of self, which is transcendent in a way to all the things that are happening, to all the content that's happening. The content the sensations, the thoughts, the reactivity is all just content that's happening in the empty, spacious mind of pure awareness. And something or someone is present to witness that process. That's you. That's who you really are. That's your deeper self, or that's your higher self. So self-sadism is releasing attachment to these things to identify with that higher self. And from the perspective of that higher self, there's a sadistic bent to it. There's a sense almost like, isn't this interesting? Isn't this an interesting pickle that you've put yourself in? What are you going to do now? What's going to happen? How are you going to get out of this one? And there's a sense of calm and joyful amusement. Okay? In a toxic form, this could look like cruelty. And that's why sadism, if it's happening in a toxic form, is pretty much synonymous with cruelty towards others, or potentially cruelty towards yourself. But it's rarely cruelty towards yourself, because people are rarely ever cruel towards oneself when they're identified as the higher self. It's usually just a sense of compassion. But you can have a sense of compassion and still understand the bigger picture about who you are and what's going on, and still be amused and seeing it almost like it's a kind of a game or an entertainment. And it's from this attitude that you're watching this whole thing unfold, and you have a hand in it. So you're helping yourself get through it. Like the process I talked about earlier was a type of mindfulness where you're like untangling every different sensation and separating them out to where the whole experience of suffering just dissolves. Well, that is what happens with the self-sadism. Now, with either one of these, you're going to probably end up in a similar position in terms of the spiritual aspect to it, your relationship to higher self or God or whatever. You know, I think you could sense how they both have that aspect, but it's a different orientation. It's a different disposition of personality that would prefer one or the other. And this is actually, in a way, very reflective of the difference in disposition between, say, Christianity, which prefers to have a relationship with the divine as an outside thing, and there's an aspect of devotion and surrender, but that's not me. And Buddhism, which is actually a transcendence of everything to the point where you're like, that is me. Not an egoic sense of like, I am God, but a complete seeing through of the sense of a permanent separate self that then results in the experience of consciousness inseparable from anything or anyone else, including God. But you can see how these both have the spiritual dimension to them from a different angle. I think that's all I want to say on that topic today. I hope that was interesting.